Hello, Life Science. We're going to continue studying botany. Today we're looking at plant reproduction, specifically the structure of flowers. So flowers are actually the reproductive organs of most plants. There are some plants that don't reproduce with flowers. They reproduce with cones or spores instead. However, most of the plant species are a part of that phylum Anthophyta, which do reproduce with flowers. So let's take a look at the structure of flowers, starting from outside the flower, moving up the stem towards them. So there is a specialized stem called a pedicel, which holds the flower, and it's got a swelling on the top called a receptacle. This holds the flower bud as it develops and supports the flower. So if you remember back from the section on leaves, they have their own little stem that supports them. Well, flowers have their own little stem that supports them too, and it's called a pedicel, and it's got a receptacle at the top of it. Above that are these little green leaf-like structures. It's not quite the same as the leaves that are used for photosynthesis, but they're flat and they're thin and they're broad, so leaf-like is a good description. They enclose the bud of the flower, protecting it while it develops, but then they peel back to reveal the flower when it's ready. When the flower is blooming, then the sepals peel back and they let the actual bloom of the flower come out and reveal it. Speaking of when a flower blooms and is revealed, here comes the star of the show, the petals. The petals are the part of the flower that everybody knows and loves. Again, they are leaf-like structures above the sepals, not leaf-like because they perform photosynthesis, but because they're thin and they're wide. They contain carotenoids and other pigments, which is why they're so pretty to look at. And their epidermis often contains fragrant oils, which is why they're so nice to sniff. These fragrant oils on the epidermis, remember that an epidermis is just the thin layer of cells like on the surface of something. So the bright colors and pleasant smell don't just attract gardeners, they also attract pollinators like insects. It's pretty difficult to miss a really brightly colored, nice smelling thing. Let's just face it, it's really easy to catch your eye, even if you have compound eyes, because like you're a bug or something. Moving on. So the stamens are the male reproductive organ of the flower. These are long filaments that kind of stand out of the flower, and they have a little thing at the top called an anther. This anther is where all the pollen grains are. Now, pollen grains are the haploid cells, the sperm cells. They're the male gametes of a plant. They contain half of a plant's DNA, and it's in particular the male half of it. So that's the stamen. At the top of the stamen is an anther. That's where the pollen is. It's held up so it's easily accessible to insect pollinators that are coming by, but also so that the wind can blow it away. Okay, now the female reproductive organ part of the flower is called a carpel, although if you read other books, it may call it a pistil. But let's talk about the carpel for a moment. So a carpel is made of 3 parts, and I decided to bring a visual aid along to help illustrate it. So this is roughly shaped like a carpel, and the fact that it's associated with flowers should make it pretty memorable. So first off, at the top of this, if this were a carpel, this would be the stigma. This is a part of the carpel that is covered in a sticky substance to catch pollen. Now, you may know the word stigma from other contexts. Like a stigma is like some sort of bad reputation that something has that maybe might cause some prejudice against it. Stigma refers to something that sticks, kind of like how that bad reputation can stick to you. Well, stigma, meaning sticky, is the perfect name for the top of the carpel, which is sticky in order to catch pollen grains. Holding up the stigma is something called the style, and I'd remind you that that's related to a word like stylus. Now, if you have, like, say, a tablet or just something with a touch screen, maybe you're familiar with using a stylus. It's basically like a pen, but it's made specifically for touch screens, and the point is that it is a long, thin thing. Well, this particular vase, this isn't very long or thin, but it is the thinnest part of it, and it does reach from the bottom to the top. So depending on what vase or what carpel you're looking at, you might actually find a little pinch in the middle that's fairly long and thin, kind of like a stylus. It holds up the stigma, and it's rooted in the ovary. Now, the ovary contains the ovule, which is where the embryo sac develops. So basically there's an egg inside, or, depending on the flower, many eggs inside. And when the stigma, which is sticky, catches pollen grains, then it can take them down to the eggs in the embryo sac, where they can develop and form seeds. All right, thanks. Anyway, so let's move on. Flower structure can be divided into two groups. There are the perfect flowers and then the imperfect flowers. Perfect flowers contain both stamens and carpels, whereas imperfect flowers contain only stamens or carpels. Now, perfect and imperfect there isn't a judgment call, like flowers with stamens and carpels are better than flowers without them. It's just a description of their completeness within the reproductive cycle. And right here is one of those little parts of biology, of life science, that I think is really eye-opening. I don't know about you, but I've been a human all my life, so I've gotten fairly used to it by now. And the way that we look at nature, we tend to associate most closely with things that are fairly similar to us. So, we look at other animals as nature, and sometimes we kind of look at plants like they're the furniture. Like they're not living things like animals are, that they're just part of the earth, whereas all the animals are inhabitants of the earth. And I think that's really unfair. Plants are alive just like animals are, and they even have reproductive cycles just like animals do. But because we are used to the animal version of that, in which you have generally sexually dimorphic species, in which you have predominantly male members and predominantly female members that only play one part in their reproductive cycle, plants aren't like that. You don't have boy trees and girl trees. You just have trees. And on their branches, in their flowers, you have both male and female reproductive organs within the same flower. I think that just goes to show that the idea that we have of how reproduction works and what it is really colored a lot just by being human and not necessarily by what nature is and how it works. Anyway, just a thought for you. So self-fertilization is a funny thing that can happen, in which the pollen, remember, on the anthers held up by the stamen of one flower, that pollen may end up getting caught in that flower's own carpel, getting stuck in the stigma, traveling down the style down to the ovary. This is something that can happen, and it's actually not bad. So think of it like this. A plant has its DNA. It separates it into a male haploid half and a female haploid half. It sticks the male half up in the pollen and the female half down the eggs. Then it just recombines them. Okay, so a plant can make a clone of itself. Okay, well, that doesn't offer a lot of diversity. Part of the benefit of sexual reproduction is that every generation is unique, and depending on what particular mutations there are in either the female or the male or both, if it happens to be beneficial or advantageous, then that next generation will have it. Not only that, but certain kinds of dangers that target certain genetic weaknesses will only affect organisms with that unique weakness, And if you have a genetically distinct next generation, then they're going to not be susceptible to that. There's a lot of advantages to mixing up your DNA every generation. So there are some ways that plants have to avoid self-fertilization. For example, in some plants, the male and the female parts mature at different times. So within a particular flower, the anthers will not be full of pollen at the same time that the stigma is ready to catch pollen. So that's one way that a flower might avoid self-fertilization. In other flowers, some plants have chemical mechanisms that reject their own pollen. Basically, the flower's own pollen lands in the carpel, and the flower has a way of saying, nope, no thank you, not using you. And last of all, of course, plants with imperfect flowers can't self-fertilize because the anthers and the carpels aren't in the same flower. So it's kind of hard to do that if they're in different places, right? Okay, so there are various kinds of flowers, and one particular kind is a composite flower. That is a flower that is made up of several individual flowers, like sunflowers as an example, rather than just like, you know, a single flower with its own set of stamens and its own carpel. This is a bunch of them all kind of put together into one macrostructure. Okay, so that is all that we are going to do as far as flowers go today. I hope that you take this opportunity where you've got a lot of time possibly to spend outside, depending on your situation, to go check some flowers out. Flowers aren't available all year round, at least not outside, so go check them out before they're gone.